The night air was thick with tension, the flashing red and blue lights slicing through the darkness like jagged lightning. The deafening wail of sirens drowned out the city's usual hum. A woman screamed. Not just any scream, this was raw, desperate, the kind that claws at the soul. "Stop. I have a condition. You're hurting me." But the officers didn't listen. A shaky cell phone camera caught the moment. Two uniformed officers yanked a woman from the driver's seat of her car, her legs dragging limply against the rough pavement. She struggled, arms flailing, fingers clawing at the air, but her lower body remained motionless. She was paralyzed. "Please. I can't walk," she cried out again. One officer hesitated. The other didn't. A knee pressed into her back, pinning her to the ground. The pavement burned against her cheek. The camera zoomed in as she gasped for breath, her arms trembling beneath their grip. "You're resisting," barked the taller officer, his voice like cold steel. "I can't resist." Her voice broke, swallowed by the chaos around her. Then, a moment of stillness, just long enough for an eerie realization to settle in. And then, she went silent. Too silent. The bystanders recording the scene murmured in alarm. The officers, once full of aggression, suddenly looked uncertain. Something was very, very wrong. The camera jerked as someone rushed forward, their voice cracking in fear. "Oh my God! She's not moving!" And then, the unthinkable happened. The officer closest to her scrambled backward, his face draining of color. The other reached for his radio, his hands shaking. The woman, still sprawled on the ground, wasn't responding. What had they done? The world seemed to hold its breath. The woman lay motionless on the cold pavement, her body twisted unnaturally. The onlookers, who had been filming in shock, now edged closer, their voices overlapping in panicked murmurs. "She's not moving. She's not breathing." The taller officer's hand hovered over his holster as if unsure whether he should reach for a weapon or his radio. The other officer, the one who had pressed her down, suddenly scrambled to flip her over. "Ma'am." His voice wavered. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. "Call an ambulance," a bystander yelled. But no one moved, not the officers, not even the woman's body. Then, the shaky voice of a teenage girl holding her phone cut through the silence. "Did you guys just kill her?" The words hung in the air like a curse. One of the officers, his forehead now beading with sweat, fumbled for his radio. We have an unresponsive female at our location. He glanced at his partner. "She's not conscious. Requesting medical now." The video, which was still being recorded by multiple people, zoomed in on the woman's lifeless face. Then, suddenly, her lips parted. A shallow gasp escaped her. A cough. Her fingers twitched. She was alive. But the relief was short-lived. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps, and when she finally managed to speak, her words sent a chill down everyone's spine. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't walk." The officers exchanged looks, then panic set in. One of them moved to grab her arm again, but the crowd erupted. "Don't touch her," a man shouted. "You already hurt her." A woman pushed forward. "She said she's disabled." "What's wrong with you?" The taller officer turned to face the growing mob. "Everyone needs to back up now," he ordered, his hand still hovering over his holster. But no one was backing up. The scene was unraveling. More phones were raised. More voices joined in. Then, in the distance, sirens. The ambulance was coming. But for the officers, it was too late. The damage was done. And the cameras, they had caught every single second. Backstory. 12 hours earlier. Beep, beep, beep. Melissa Gaines slapped the snooze button on her alarm and groaned. Her entire body ached, like it always did. She reached for the bottle of muscle relaxers by her bedside, dry swallowing a pill before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Except, only one of them moved. She sighed. This was her reality. A spinal injury from a car accident 3 years ago had left her paralyzed from the waist down. She had some feeling in her legs, but walking? Impossible. Still, Melissa had learned to live with it. She had a specially modified car, a career in graphic design that allowed her to work from home, and a service dog named Ollie, who was snoring softly in his bed. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A quick drive to the pharmacy. A stop at her sister's house. Then back home. But as she rolled into her wheelchair and got ready for the day, she had no idea that, before the night was over, her face would be on every screen in America. And that the world would soon see what happens when power is abused. 12 hours after Melissa's quiet morning, her world had been turned upside down. The ambulance screeched to a halt, red and white lights flashing wildly as the paramedics jumped out. The officers, once in control of the scene, now looked like caged animals, cornered, exposed. Melissa was barely conscious, her breaths shallow. A paramedic knelt beside her, fingers pressing against her neck, searching for a pulse. "She's in distress," he muttered to his partner. Carefully, they lifted her onto a stretcher. That was when they saw it, the deep red marks around her wrists, her arms bruised from the force used against her. But the worst was her lower body. Her legs, normally still but pain-free, were contorted unnaturally, signs of a trauma she had yet to fully process. The lead paramedic looked up at the officers. "What happened here?" The taller officer stammered. She was resisting." The crowd erupted. "She told you she couldn't walk. You dragged her out of her car. She wasn't resisting, you were just too damn blind to see it." Melissa's eyes flickered open. Her lips parted, her voice raspy. "I told you," she croaked. "I told you. I'm paralyzed." The paramedic's expression darkened. He turned back to the officers. "She needs to get to a hospital, now." Melissa was loaded into the ambulance, but before the doors shut, she caught one last thing, one of the officers whispering into his radio, his voice tight with panic. "Tell the captain we might have a problem." And they did. A very big problem. 4 hours later, at the hospital, Melissa's sister, Jamie, burst through the doors of the emergency room, her heart hammering. "Where is she?" she demanded, gripping the nurse's counter. "Melissa Gaines." "The woman, the police." The nurse nodded quickly, eyes filled with concern. "She's in room 307. But..." Jamie didn't wait for the rest. She ran. When she entered the room, her breath caught. Melissa lay in a hospital bed, 4 tubes in her arm, her face pale and tired. A neck brace had been placed around her, and a hospital gown replaced her torn hoodie. But it wasn't just her condition that stunned Jamie, it was the 2 officers standing at the foot of her bed. "What the hell are they doing here?" Jamie snapped, storming in. Melissa weakly turned her head. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They won't leave." Jamie rounded on the officers. "Get out." The taller one sighed. "Ma'am, we're just here to..." Jamie cut him off. "To what?" "Cover this up." "Intimidate her." The second officer cleared his throat. "We just have a few questions." "No. No, you don't," Jamie seethed. "She almost died tonight because of you. She's not answering a damn thing without a lawyer." A silence stretched between them. Then, the first officer, looking increasingly uncomfortable, pulled out a small notepad. "If she won't answer questions now," he said stiffly, "we'll be back later." Jamie didn't blink. "Try it. And see how fast this blows up in your faces." The officers exchanged a glance before reluctantly stepping out of the room. Jamie turned back to her sister, tears threatening to spill. Melissa gave a weak, tired smile. "Guess I made the news." Jamie exhaled sharply. "Melissa, the whole world saw what happened to you." And at that moment, Melissa realized, this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's. Melissa's eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion pulling at her like an anchor. She had never felt this kind of pain before, not just in her body, but in her soul. Her entire world had shifted in a matter of hours. She had gone out to pick up medication. Now, she was the center of a national firestorm. Jamie sat beside her, scrolling furiously through her phone. Her face was tight with barely contained rage. "Melissa," she whispered, "you have no idea how big this has gotten." Melissa blinked at her sister. "How bad?" Jamie turned the screen toward her. Melissa inhaled sharply. Everywhere, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the news, her name was everywhere. #JusticeForMelissa was trending worldwide. The video of the officers dragging her out of the car had millions of views. Celebrities, politicians, and activists were speaking out. News channels were replaying the footage on a loop. The world had seen what happened, and they were furious. Melissa's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the comments. This is disgusting. Those officers need to be fired immediately. Paralyzed and they still brutalized her? Unbelievable. This isn't just an accident. This is abuse. Then, Jamie clicked on a breaking news report. The headline made Melissa's blood run cold. Police department under investigation following viral arrest of disabled woman. Beneath it, a news anchor was speaking. The 2 officers involved in the detainment of Melissa Gaines have been placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation is conducted. Protests have erupted across the city, with demonstrators demanding justice. City officials are facing mounting pressure to respond. Melissa swallowed hard. This was bigger than her now, and that terrified her. The protests begin. Outside the hospital, a crowd had formed. Hundreds of people stood behind barricades, holding signs with bold, angry messages. Disability is not a crime. Justice for Melissa now. Hold them accountable. The chants were deafening. No justice. No peace. Jamie peeked out the hospital window. Melissa, she murmured, they're here for you. Melissa's heart pounded. She had spent most of her life avoiding attention, keeping to herself, just trying to survive. But now, she was a symbol. And she had a choice to make. Did she step forward and fight? Or did she stay silent and hope it all faded away? The officers speak out. Meanwhile, inside the police station, the 2 officers sat in a dimly lit office. Sweat dripped down their brows. They weren't just under investigation. They were under fire. This is out of control, the taller officer muttered, rubbing his temples. People are losing their damn minds over this. The second officer, who had held Melissa down, leaned forward. His jaw clenched. We need to get ahead of this. Tell our side. The first officer scoffed. And what's our side? We assaulted a disabled woman on camera. The second officer hesitated. Then he shook his head. We say we didn't know she was paralyzed. The first officer's head snapped up. What? We say she never told us. That she was acting suspicious. That we followed protocol. His voice was urgent now. If we let this keep spiraling, we're done. Fired. Maybe even charged. A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, the first officer nodded. And just like that, their strategy was set. Twist the narrative. Make it seem like Melissa was to blame. Melissa lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. She had barely slept. How could she? Outside, the protests grew larger by the hour. The sound of chanting drifted through her hospital window, a constant reminder that this wasn't just her fight anymore. Her phone buzzed. It was Jamie, sending another link. Melissa hesitated before clicking. And then she saw it. Breaking news. Officers claimed they were unaware of woman's disability during arrest. She read on, her stomach tightening with every word. The officers involved in the detainment of Melissa Gaines have released a statement through their legal representatives, stating that they had no knowledge of her paralysis at the time of the arrest. They allege that Ms. Gaines was acting erratically and that her failure to comply with their commands led to unnecessary use of force. The department is now urging the public to wait for all the facts before making conclusions. Melissa's hands clenched around the phone. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They're lying. Jamie stormed into the room, her face flushed with rage. Did you see this? They're trying to flip the whole thing. Melissa nodded slowly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. They knew. I told them. I told them over and over. Jamie exhaled sharply, pacing the room. They're doing damage control. If enough people believe them, they'll get away with this. Melissa swallowed the lump in her throat. They're making me the villain. Jamie stopped pacing. Are you going to let them? Silence. Then, slowly, Melissa sat up straighter. No. Her voice was stronger now. No, I'm not. Jamie's eyes lit up with fierce determination. Then we fight back. That night, as the world debated whether she was a victim or a liar, Melissa made a decision. She grabbed her phone, hit record, and took a deep breath. Then she spoke. "They're saying they didn't know I was paralyzed." She let out a shaky laugh, bitterness laced in her voice. "They knew. I told them. And they still dragged me out of my car like I wasn't even human." She looked into the camera, her expression unwavering. "I wasn't resisting. I couldn't resist." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "They're lying to save themselves. But I won't let them." She hesitated, then said the words that changed everything. "I want them charged." Then, she ended the video and posted it. Within minutes, it went viral. The police department hadn't expected this. They had assumed Melissa would stay quiet, that fear and trauma would keep her in the shadows. But now, her face was everywhere. And her words, they were louder than the lies. The morning after her video, news anchors dissected every second of it. Experts weighed in. Lawyers debated whether the officers had committed a crime. And the protests, they exploded. Thousands took to the streets. Signs reading, "Charge them now," and "Justice for Melissa," filled the air. The mayor called an emergency press conference. The governor issued a statement. The police chief, he was sweating. And then, the unthinkable happened. The FBI got involved. Inside the police station, the two officers sat across from their lawyer, their faces pale. "This is getting worse," the first officer muttered. "The feds. Are you kidding me?" The lawyer exhaled, rubbing his temples. "They're looking into civil rights violations," he said grimly. "This is no longer just about policy. If they find evidence that you knowingly abused a disabled woman," he trailed off. The second officer sat up. "We need to stick to the story. We didn't know." The lawyer gave him a cold, knowing look. "Did you?" A heavy silence. The second officer swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter now." The lawyer sighed. "Then pray there's no proof." But there was. And the world was about to see it. The truth is catching up to them. Do you think justice will be served? Drop a comment below. And if you're still watching, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the pressure on. The city was on fire, not with flames, but with fury. Crowds flooded the streets, their voices rising like a storm. The pressure on the police department was unbearable. The mayor, the governor, even federal officials were all watching closely. And then, the video surfaced. Not the one the public had already seen. This was body cam footage. Someone had leaked it. News stations scrambled to get it on air, and within minutes, millions of people were watching. The truth, in high definition. The footage started inside Melissa's car. A flashlight shined in her face as the officer barked orders. "Step out of the vehicle." "I can't," Melissa's voice trembled, but she was clear. "I'm disabled. I'm paralyzed." The officer's flashlight shifted slightly. "What?" "I can't walk," she repeated, her voice desperate now. "Please, I have a spinal condition." The camera shook as the officer yanked at her door handle. "I said step out." Melissa clung to the steering wheel. "I physically can't." But they weren't listening. The next moment, the video cut to the officers forcibly pulling her from the car, her lifeless legs dragging against the ground as she screamed. Then came the worst part. As she lay face down on the pavement, one of the officers, the same one who had sworn they didn't know she was disabled, was caught on camera muttering, "Oh such *T, she wasn't lying." Silence. The video ended. And the internet exploded. It wasn't just outrage anymore. It was war. The officers had lied. They knew. The evidence was undeniable. News anchors sat in stunned silence before scrambling to cover the fallout. Social media erupted. And the protests, they tripled in size. People weren't just demanding their suspension anymore. They were demanding arrests. Inside police headquarters, chaos reigned. The chief paced in his office, his phone ringing non-stop. Reporters were outside the building. The mayor was on the other line. And the FBI, they were knocking on his door. With cameras flashing, he finally stepped out for a press conference. His face was grave. Effective immediately, Officers Richard Calloway and James Turner have been terminated from the force, he announced. A roar of approval rose from the watching crowd. But he wasn't done. "We are fully cooperating with federal investigators." He hesitated. "And given the new evidence, both former officers are now under criminal investigation." The crowd erupted. Melissa, watching from her hospital bed, felt her breath catch. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, it was going in her favor. The officer's last chance. Inside a dimly lit interrogation room, Richard Calloway and James Turner sat with their lawyer. Across from them, federal agents. "You lied," the lead agent stated, flipping open a folder. Neither officer spoke. "You knew she was disabled. You assaulted her anyway." Still, silence. Then the agent leaned forward. "We have two options here. You both go to trial. Or one of you talks." Richard Calloway, the taller officer, the one who had hesitated that night, glanced at his partner. James Turner's face was stone. But Richard's leg bounced under the table. Sweat lined his brow. And then, to everyone's shock, he cracked. He exhaled, leaned forward, and whispered, "I'll talk." Richard Calloway sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling slightly as he licked his lips. He knew what was coming. If he didn't talk, they'd both go down. But if he did, maybe, just maybe, he could save himself. The federal agent across from him wasted no time. "You understand what this means, Calloway? If you cooperate, you're looking at a plea deal. If you don't," he leaned in, "you're looking at federal charges." Calloway swallowed hard. He turned his head slightly, glancing at his former partner, James Turner. Turner's expression was cold. A silent warning. But Calloway had already made up his mind. "I didn't want to hurt her," he mumbled, voice barely above a whisper. The agent stayed silent. Calloway exhaled sharply. His hands balled into fists. "But Turner..." He glanced at his ex-partner. "He didn't care." I hesitated. "He didn't." Turner's jaw clenched. "You're a coward," he muttered. Calloway ignored him. He turned back to the agent. "We knew," he admitted. "We knew she was disabled. She told us. Over and over." The air in the room seemed to shift. And then, he dropped the final bombshell. Turner said, "It doesn't matter. Get her on the ground." The agent's face remained unreadable, but his eyes flickered with something sharp. That was it. That was intent. And that meant charges. 1 week later, the city's courthouse was surrounded. Thousands of protesters lined the steps, holding signs, chanting. Inside, Melissa sat in a wheelchair at the plaintiff's table, her attorney beside her. At the defendant's table, James Turner sat stone-faced in his orange jumpsuit. Richard Calloway sat next to him, but he wasn't in a jumpsuit. He had taken the deal. Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone in front of her. This was it. Her moment. She looked Turner dead in the eye. And then, she told the world exactly what had happened that night. From the moment she was pulled over, to the terror she felt as she was dragged out, to the exact second she thought she might die on that pavement. She spared no details. The courtroom was silent. Then, finally, the judge spoke. The verdict came swiftly. James Turner, guilty of excessive force and civil rights violations. The sentence, 10 years in federal prison. Calloway, in exchange for his testimony, received 5 years probation and permanent decertification as an officer. The courtroom erupted. Melissa. She let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't erase what had happened to her. But it was justice. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Melissa got justice. But is it enough? What do you think about the sentencing? Let us know in the comments. And if you've been following this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to make sure stories like this never get buried. The courtroom was still buzzing when Melissa rolled out of the building, flanked by Jamie and her legal team. The moment she emerged, the crowd erupted into cheers. She had won. But as she looked out at the sea of supporters, people holding signs, chanting her name, demanding justice for others like her, she realized something. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. Melissa, how do you feel about the verdict? Melissa took a breath. She had rehearsed a dozen answers, but in the end, she spoke from the heart. I'm relieved, she said. But this isn't just about one case. It's about a system that let this happen in the first place. The reporter pressed forward. What's next for you? Melissa glanced at Jamie, who gave her a knowing smile. I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else, she said firmly. Not without a fight. 1 year later, Melissa sat in front of her laptop, reading the latest news. Melissa Gaines wins civil suit against police department, awarded $3.5 million in damages. It was a victory, but that wasn't what mattered most to her. Her case had sparked change. The city had passed new laws requiring disability training for all officers. The department had overhauled its use of force policies. And across the country, people were finally paying attention. Her face was no longer just a headline. She was a movement. Her phone buzzed. Jamie, turn on the news. Melissa raised an eyebrow and grabbed the remote. The screen flickered on, revealing a breaking news banner. Former Officer James Turner found dead in prison cell, apparent suicide. Melissa's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about Turner much since the trial. She had wanted justice, not vengeance. But now, it was over. Truly over. She exhaled, setting the remote down. Jamie texted again. Jamie, how do you feel? Melissa stared at the screen, then slowly typed her response. Melissa, like I finally get to move on. She turned off the TV, wheeled herself to her desk, and opened a new document on her laptop. Title, Power and Silence. The Fight for Justice. Melissa smiled to herself. The end. What an intense journey. What do you think about how it all ended? Should Melissa have done more? Did Turner get what he deserved? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share, because stories like this need to be heard. Thanks for watching. More stories coming soon.